The Veteran's Promise is the kind of drama that grabs you by the collar with this very simple, very dangerous sentence. You don't get to hurt a soldier's family and then go back to your life like nothing happened. And look, I know how that sounds. It sounds like a bumper sticker fantasy. It sounds like the sort of thing that could turn into 200 men in tactical gear solving every problem with a clenched jaw and a conveniently timed soundtrack drop. But the reason this show stuck to my ribs for days is because it doesn't just want to feel righteous. It wants to feel true. Not true like a documentary. True like the way grief lives in your body. True like loyalty that borders on self-destruction. True like the kind of brotherhood that makes grown men answer a phone call they absolutely should not answer because it means walking back into the fire. Welcome back to Flick Flare. And yes, we're doing full spoilers. So if you haven't watched A Veteran's Promise yet and you want to go in clean, pause me now and come back when you've been emotionally body slammed like the rest of us. If you've been hanging out here and you like these long, story-first deep dives where I get a little too invested, consider subscribing. What I loved most about this series is that it understands the seduction of its own premise, and it still takes the time to show you the bill that comes due. The setup is almost mythic. A veteran builds a new life after the military, trying to do the normal people stuff, routine, work, maybe a relationship that doesn't involve radio silence and blood. And he tells himself he's moved on. But he never forgot the men who fought beside him. And when his fallen brother's widow and daughter are threatened, one phone call changes everything. 200 battle-hardened veterans answer without hesitation. That's the line that sells the show, the mic drop. But the show's real obsession isn't the 200. It's the pause before the call. It's that little moment where a man realizes the life he built is about to get cracked open. Not because he wants revenge, but because there are some promises you keep even if keeping them ruins you. And let me say this early. The series is way more tender than its marketing wants you to think. It's not soft, exactly, but it's tender in the way it keeps circling back to the widow and the daughter as people, not props. That matters. Because the easiest version of this story is bad guys threaten family, hero assembles an army, bad guys learn a lesson. The Veteran's Promise keeps reminding you that the family at the center is living with an absence that never stops being loud. The brother isn't just a heroic memory, he's an empty chair. He's a birthday that still gets celebrated awkwardly. He's a photo on a mantle that starts to feel like a witness stand when men begin making plans in the living room. The show's pacing is patient in a way that surprised me. And I mean that as a compliment and a warning depending on your tolerance. If you came for pure momentum, you might feel the early stretch taking its time. But for me, those quieter scenes are where the series earns its later escalation. It spends time on the veteran's new life, not as some generic before picture, but as a fragile construction. You can feel how hard he's working to be normal. The show's camera language even changes around that idea. In the civilian world, it tends to sit a little steadier, the frames a little more composed, the light a little more forgiving. Then the threat enters, and suddenly the compositions tighten, the negative space gets meaner, and you start seeing him framed through doorways or half obscured, like the show is already telling you, you can't fully see this man anymore, because he's already turning back into someone he promised himself he wouldn't need to be. If you're wondering when it goes from simmer to boil, it's the phone call. And I don't mean the literal moment of dialing, though that's executed with this almost ritualistic weight. I mean the concept of it. The idea that a single call can resurrect a whole network of people who have been trying in their own messy ways to become civilians. There's a lot of fiction where brotherhood is just dialogue, just men calling each other brother while the plot shoves them around like action figures. Here, you feel the cost. You feel that these are people with jobs, with families, with bodies that ache in the morning, with trauma that doesn't announce itself politely. And when they answer, it's not framed like, heck yeah, adventure. It's framed like, oh, we're doing this. We're really doing this. The funniest part, funny in that bleak way where you laugh because your throat is tight. is how the show doesn't glamorize the logistics, but it also doesn't bog down in them. It uses quick observational beats, a veteran hesitating before opening a locked case, someone else staring a little too long at a group photo before grabbing their keys, a spouse clocking what's happening with one look and going quiet because they've seen this movie before and they hate the ending. And as viewers, we understand exactly what's being said without a speech. That's good TV. That's trust. Here's the question that kept buzzing in my head as the series went on. Is this a story about protection or a story about permission? Because the veteran isn't just protecting his fallen brother's family. He's also giving himself permission to re-enter a version of life where purpose is simple and sharp. And the show is honest about how intoxicating that can be. When you've lived through something that bonded you to people in ways most civilians can't relate to, a normal life can feel like you're wearing someone else's clothes. It fits technically, but you're always tugging at the collar. One of the strongest choices the writers make is not turning the widow into a saintly emblem. She's grieving, yes, but she's also exhausted. She's also weary. She's also a parent, which means she's doing that brutal math every day of what her daughter can handle, what she can't, what truth will help her grow, and what truth will just shatter her. The threat against them isn't just a plot device. It becomes this pressure that exposes fault lines in everyone's coping mechanisms. The veteran wants to respond with action because action is a language he speaks fluently. The widow wants control because her life already got stolen once. And the daughter, depending on her age in your mind as you watch, because the show plays her with this mixture of innocence and premature sharpness, becomes the emotional center without needing to be precocious in that corny way. And then there's the fallen brother, the ghost in the room. He's not present, but he's everywhere. The veteran's promise does this thing I'm obsessed with where it treats memory like a character with its own agenda. The veteran remembers his brother one way when he's alone, another way when he's with the widow, and another way when he's with the other veterans. That's real. We all curate memory depending on who we're trying to survive in front of. And the show uses that to complicate the idea of promise. A promise to whom? The dead? The living? Yourself? And what happens when those promises collide? Let me drop you into the mini scene that, for me, is the beating heart of the whole series. The moment I realized I wasn't just entertained, I was in. It's late, or it feels late, the kind of night where the house is too quiet and every sound is a confession. The veteran is in a kitchen that looks lived in, but not cozy, coffee mug ring on the counter, a chair that creaks, a fridge hum that suddenly feels aggressive. He's got his phone in his hand like it weighs more than it should. You can see him breathing through something. His thumb hovers. Not because he doesn't know who to call, because he knows exactly what will happen if he does. And the camera doesn't do any flashy pushing. It just stays close enough to catch that tiny shift in his eyes when he commits. The call connects. There's a beat. And when the voice on the other end answers, there's no banter. No long time. Just recognition. Like a door opening in a hallway that's been locked for years. And then the show does this restrained, devastating montage, hands tightening on steering wheels, boots hitting porches, faces in dim rooms lit by TV glow turning towards something of screen, a wedding ring being slipped off and set down gently like an apology, a text left unsent. It's not hype. It's gravity. 200 lives tilting. That sequence also showcases the series' sound design, which is sneakily excellent. You don't get the usual bombastic, assemble the team, music cue right away. You get small sounds turned up. The click of a lighter, the scrape of a chair, the soft buzz of a phone vibrating on wood. It makes the whole thing feel intimate, like you're eavesdropping on a collective relapse into purpose. And when the score finally comes in, more of a low, steady thrum than a melody, it's almost like a pulse under the scene, reminding you, this is a body remembering how to move. Now, I can already hear a certain kind of viewer saying, okay, but 200 veterans showing up? That's ridiculous. And I get it. On paper, it's absurd. But here's my respectful contrarian take. The number is not meant to be realistic in a literal sense. It's meant to be psychological. It's the show externalizing the scale of a promise. It's the story saying, this isn't one man's revenge fantasy. This is a community of people who are trained to respond to threats with coordination, and who never got a clean off-ramp back into civilian morality. The 200 becomes a symbol of how big that invisible network feels when you're the person being threatened. It's the difference between I can intimidate one guy and I have awakened a whole past. And the show doesn't pretend that's automatically noble. That's what saves it from being pure propaganda. Because once the veterans mobilize, the series starts asking uncomfortable questions. When does protection become escalation? When does loyalty become addiction? When you're used to solving problems with force, can you tell the difference between necessary and familiar? The veteran's promise flirts with that line constantly. And it's most effective when it's not making speeches about it, but when it's showing the widow's reaction to having her home filled with men who carry themselves like weapons even when they're sitting down. There are scenes where you can feel her doing that parent thing, scanning faces, assessing risk, trying to decide whether these men are guardians or another kind of danger. And to the show's credit, it doesn't paint her as ungrateful for that. It lets her fear be intelligent. It lets her say, in 1,000 little ways, I didn't ask for an army in my living room. And the veteran has to sit with that. He can't just bulldoze with good intentions. He has to reckon with the fact that what makes him feel safe might make them feel trapped. That's where the lead performance really impressed me. I'm not going to pretend I know what actor training went into it, but the physicality is so specific. He moves like someone who has learned to take up space efficiently, like his body still remembers how to clear a room even when he's just walking into a kitchen. And when he's trying to be normal, you can see him softening his posture on purpose. There's this micro expression he does, this quick swallow, this tightening at the corner of the mouth whenever someone brings up the brother. It's not big. It's not showy. It's the kind of reaction you only notice because it keeps happening. And then you realize, oh, that's his tell. That's the moment where grief turns into steel. The ensemble of veterans could have been a blur, a sea of similar faces. But the show takes care to make them feel like individuals without turning it into a roll call. You pick up on personalities through behavior. The one who cracks jokes at the wrong time because silence scares him. The one who's too calm because he's the most dangerous. The one who hangs back and watches exits. The one who keeps trying to be the peacemaker like he's still playing squad counselor. And what I appreciated is that the series doesn't worship them uncritically. Some of these men are haunted. Some are immature. Some are looking for an excuse. The show lets that complexity breathe, which makes the moments of genuine tenderness hit harder. Because there are tender moments. And I'm going to admit something that surprised me. I got weirdly emotional at the scenes that weren't about threat at all. The little beats where the daughter is around these veterans, and you can see them trying to calibrate themselves. They don't want to scare her. They also don't know how to be gentle without feeling awkward. There's something heartbreakingly human about a battle-hardened person trying to speak in a softer register and not quite knowing the words. And when the show gives you a glimpse of the daughter clocking that, seeing that these men are scary, but also trying, it becomes this quiet story about what children inherit from adult violence, even when the adults are trying their best. Stick with me, because the series' biggest strength isn't the mobilization. It's what happens after the adrenaline wears off and everyone has to live in the reality they created. Visually, the veteran's promise leans into a grounded palette. It's not that washed-out, pseudo-gritty look that some shows use as a shortcut for serious. It's more controlled than that. It favors naturalistic light, but it's picky about where shadows land. Interiors feel boxed in when characters are emotionally boxed in. You'll see faces hufflet, not in a Noir way, but in a way that suggests divided selves. And when the veterans move as a group, the blocking is deliberate. They don't just stand around. The director places them like a living perimeter. It communicates safety and threat at the same time, which is exactly the contradiction the show is chewing on. Editing-wise, It's confident enough to linger. It allows awkward pauses. It lets a glance land. And that's crucial, because the drama here isn't just in what people do. It's in what they resist doing. When you have a premise this combustible, restraint becomes a character trait. The show builds tension by showing you the effort it takes for these men not to explode. That's more compelling than watching them explode right away. Anyone can write a revenge beat. Writing control is harder. There's also a subtle rhythm to how the show handles the idea of answering. The call goes out, but the answering happens in layers. Some answer immediately. Some hesitate. Some have conditions. Some show up because they can't not show up, and that difference matters. It creates internal dynamics, quiet resentments, old hierarchy, the unspoken question of who gets to lead now that they're not in uniform. And because the veteran at the center has built a new life, he's not automatically the same person he was back then. That tension between who he was in the military and who he is now drives so much of the show's interpersonal drama. And then you have the antagonistic force, which I'm going to talk around carefully because the premise doesn't specify the exact nature of the threat. And I'm not here to make up a whole villain mythology and pretend it's canon. But the show frames the people threatening the widow and daughter as more than just faceless evil. They are a pressure system. They represent the kind of predation that thrives when it senses someone isolated. That's why the community response is so narratively satisfying. It's not just bad guys get punished. Its isolation is broken. The threat loses its power when the widow stops being alone. However, and this is important, the show also understands that bringing 200 veterans into a situation is not a clean moral act. It's a destabilizing one. The presence of that many trained people changes the temperature of everything around them. Law enforcement, neighbors, even the widow's own sense of agency. The series doesn't always push that critique as far as I wanted, but it gestures toward it enough that I felt seen as a viewer who likes my catharsis with a side of consequence. I want to talk about the title for a second, because the veteran's promise is doing double duty. On the surface, the promise is obvious. The veteran promised his fallen brother he'd look after his family. But the show keeps hinting, through dialogue, through the way characters react, that the promise is also what the veteran made to himself when he left the military. The promise to be done. The promise to build something. And by the time the 200 show up, you realize those promises are incompatible. You can keep the promise to the dead and break the promise to the living version of yourself. Or you can keep your new life intact and live with the shame of not answering. It's an emotional trap, and the show is ruthless about how it tightens. There's a particular kind of masculinity on display here that I think the show both indulges and interrogates. The indulgence is the fantasy of competence. Men who know what to do, who act decisively, who don't flail in uncertainty. That's intoxicating to watch in a world where most of us feel like we're improvising constantly. But the interrogation comes in showing how that competence can become a cage. When you're the guy who always knows what to do, you stop letting yourself not know. You stop letting yourself be soft. You stop letting yourself be helped. And the veteran at the center is so used to being the one who protects that he struggles to accept protection from the very men he called. One of the most affecting through lines, for me, is how the widow responds to being protected. Because protection can be a gift, but it can also be a form of control. The show doesn't turn this into a simplistic, strong woman doesn't need men trope, thank God. It's more nuanced. She needs help. She also needs to be the mother. She also needs to be the adult in the room. And it's hard to do that when 200 people are treating your house like an operational zone. Watching her navigate, that is some of the best drama in the series. Because it's where the moral questions get personal. And the daughter, again, the show is careful. It doesn't make her a symbol of innocence to be defended at all costs without interiority. It gives her reactions that feel messy and age-appropriate. Fear, curiosity, a weird sense of pride mixed with resentment, the occasional moment where she's just a kid, and you remember, all right, She didn't enlist in any of this. The threat against her isn't just danger, it's a theft of childhood. And when the veterans show up, they don't just bring safety. They bring the atmosphere of war. Even if no one fires a shot, the vibe changes. That is not nothing. If you're still with me, here's the pivot that made me sit up even more. The show starts turning the camera inward, away from the antagonists, and toward the veterans themselves, like it's saying, okay, you assembled the army. Now live with what you invited back into your minds. There's a stretch in the middle where you can feel the series wrestling with its own power fantasy. It gives you scenes that, in another show, would be fist-pumping moments of unity. But here they're tinted with something darker. It shows you veterans reconnecting, and you can tell it feels good. And that scares them. Because the military can be the last time some people felt uncomplicated belonging. The show doesn't demonize that feeling. It just portrays it honestly. And that honesty is what makes the emotional stakes feel real, not manufactured. I also want to shout out the way the series uses space. There's a lot of staging around thresholds, doorways, porches, gates, the edge of a yard. It's a visual language of boundaries. Who is inside? Who is outside? Who gets to cross? And because the story is about a family being threatened, those boundaries become sacred. When the veterans start taking positions, the show frames it like a protective spell being cast. But then it also shows you the family inside, hearing movement outside, and you realize, being protected can sound like being surrounded. The same footsteps can mean safety or captivity, depending on what your nervous system associates with boots. Now, I'm going to confess something, because I promised I'd be honest about my reactions, and not just do critic brain. There was a moment. Again, not a single plot twist, more of a cumulative emotional click, where I felt my own defenses go up. I come from a background where handle it yourself is basically a family heirloom. Watching a community mobilize like this hit me in this tender, slightly embarrassing place. It made me realize how rare it is, in real life, to have people show up without bargaining. Not let me know if you need anything, which is the most useless sentence ever invented, but actual showing up. And that made me emotional in a way I didn't expect from a show that also contains, 200 veterans ready to ruin someone's week. The Veterans Promise is also sneakily about grief etiquette, how people are allowed to talk about the dead, and who gets to claim them. The veteran loved his fallen brother in one way, the widow loved him in another, the daughter loves him through absence, and the other veterans love him through shared survival. Those loves don't always harmonize. Sometimes they clash. Sometimes one person's memory feels like an insult to another's. And the show mines that tension for drama without turning anyone into a villain for grieving wrong. Acting-wise, the widow's performance deserves real credit because it's so easy to write her as a device. Instead, she carries herself like someone who has had to be strong in ways that are not cinematic. There are a difference between strong as in delivering monologues and strong as in paying bills and packing lunches while your chest is collapsing. She plays that. You see it in her posture, in the way she keeps moving even when she's listening to something that should knock her over. And when she does break, when she lets herself show anger or fear, it lands because the show hasn't been using those emotions as cheap spikes. It's been banking them. And then the veterans' camaraderie, which could have been unbearable if it leaned too far into macho posturing, is surprisingly textured. There are moments of humor that feel earned, the kind of gallows humor people use to keep from shaking. And yes, some of it is very men together, in that way where they say something affectionate by insulting each other. Normally, that dynamic can feel like writers trying too hard to make men bond without vulnerability. Here, it reads more like a shield. They're trying to keep the mood light, because if they say what they actually feel, they might not be able to stop. There's also an undercurrent of, we are not supposed to be doing this, and the show lets that sit there. Even if you're cheering, you can sense the legal and moral edges. The series doesn't have to spell it out constantly. It just keeps giving you those little moments. A veteran checking the street like he's expecting sirens, someone else hesitating before stepping onto the widow's property, like they're aware of how invasive their presence is. Those details make the world feel lived in rather than engineered. And I want to linger on the concept of the promise itself because the show keeps widening it. At first, it's a promise to protect. Then it becomes a promise to remember. Then it becomes a promise to respond. And the darkest version of that is a promise to never be powerless again. That's where the show gets dangerously compelling. Because the veterans aren't just coming for the antagonists. They're also coming for their own sense of agency. They're reasserting control over a world that has made them feel disposable. And if you've ever felt disposable at work, in a family, in a system, you understand why that resonates, even if you wouldn't choose the same methods. The series also plays with the idea of hero, which is right there in the premise. You don't come after a hero's family. But what is a hero here? Is the fallen brother the hero because he died? Is the veteran the hero because he answers? Are the 200 heroes because they show up? Or is hero just a story people tell so the grief feels meaningful? The show doesn't give you a clean answer, and that's part of why it feels mature. It allows the hero label to be both honoring and suffocating. Because once someone is a hero, people stop letting them be complicated. If you're expecting me to say the show is flawless, no. There are moments where it leans a little too hard into the myth of the veterans as this unstoppable moral force. Occasionally, the writing flirts with that "you messed with the wrong people" tone so strongly that it threatens to flatten the nuance. And there are a few beats where I wished the series spent more time on the collateral emotional impact outside the core group. Because when 200 veterans mobilize, the ripple effects would be massive. The show hints at those ripples. But sometimes it chooses catharsis over complexity. But even when it chooses catharsis, it does it with craft. The direction knows how to build dread without constant action. It uses silence like a weapon. It lets you sit in the aftermath of conversations. And when it does give you momentum, it's not just quick cuts and yelling. It's purposeful movement. The veterans don't feel like a mob. They feel like a coordinated organism. That's a directorial achievement. Blocking that many bodies, even if we're not literally seeing 200 at once in every shot, because production reality exists, still requires a sense of geography and intention. The show sells the scale through smart framing and sound, not just by throwing extras at the camera. There's a recurring visual motif I kept noticing: hands. Hands on shoulders, hands on phones, hands opening doors, hands hovering before making contact. The Veterans Promise is a show about what people do with their hands when words fail. In military contexts, hands are tools. In civilian contexts, hands are comfort. The series keeps putting those two meanings in conflict. A hand that can break can also hold. And watching these characters navigate which version of themselves they're allowed to be in front of the widow and daughter is where the drama becomes genuinely affecting. Let's talk about the emotional temperature of the show's violence, too. Because even if you're not given a constant barrage of explicit brutality, the threat of it is ever present. The show treats violence like an atmosphere rather than a spectacle. It's in the way people position themselves, the way they scan rooms, the way their voices drop when they talk about what might happen. And when you do get moments of confrontation, the show tends to frame them with a kind of grim inevitability rather than glee. That's a crucial tonal distinction. It keeps the series from feeling like it's celebrating harm. And the series is at its best when it shows that the veteran's capacity for violence is not the same as his desire for it. He's not itching for a fight. He's trying to prevent one. But he's also realistic about what prevention might require. That tension makes him compelling. He's not a clean hero. He's a man with a skill set that becomes relevant again in the worst possible way. And you can see him hating that relevance even as he relies on it. I keep coming back to the idea that this show is about community, because that's what makes the 200 matter emotionally. It's easy to tell stories about lone wolves. It's harder to tell stories about a pack without turning it into propaganda. The veteran's promise mostly threads that needle by focusing on relational dynamics rather than just power. These men aren't just muscle, they're history. Every reunion has subtext. Every glance carries old arguments. Every act of loyalty is also an echo of past debt. And this is where the show's writing gets quietly sharp. It understands that brotherhood isn't automatically healthy. It can be beautiful. It can also be coercive. When someone answers the call, are they choosing freely? Or are they trapped by identity? If you've built your whole sense of worth around being the kind of person who shows up, what happens when showing up is self-harm? The series doesn't solve that question neatly. It just keeps letting it sting. There's a latent stretch. Again, speaking generally, because I'm not about to invent episode-specific beats, that tightens the screws by forcing the veteran to confront what his promise is doing to the people he's trying to save. Because the widow and daughter are not passive recipients of rescue. They react. They push back. They make choices that complicate the veteran's plans. And watching the veteran deal with that is where his arc becomes something more than Guy assembles army. He starts to realize that keeping a promise to the dead can't come at the expense of the living people's autonomy. That sounds obvious, but in practice it's messy. The show lets it be messy. And messy is where the performances shine. There are scenes where characters talk past each other, where nobody says the exact right thing, where the silence after sentence is louder than the sentence itself. That's life. And it's refreshing to see a show in this genre not always chasing quotable lines, but instead chasing emotional truth. I also appreciated the way the series treats the veterans' internal differences as dramatic fuel rather than as a threat to unity. In lesser writing, the group would be a monolith. All agree, all move, all righteous. Here, you get friction. You get disagreement about methods. You get someone questioning whether this is the right move. You get someone else who's too eager. And because these are people with shared history, those disagreements carry more weight than typical team conflict. They're not just arguing about a plan. They're arguing about who they are now. There's a line the show keeps circling without necessarily saying directly. You can take the soldier out of the war, but you can't take the war out of the soldier. It's a cliché, but the show makes it feel specific by showing how war lives in mundane habits. The way someone sits with their back to a wall. The way someone wakes up too fast. The way someone's laughter stops suddenly when a car backfires outside. Those details aren't there to scream PTSD at the audience. They're there to make these characters feel like bodies with memories. And that's why, even when the show goes big, it never fully leaves the human scale. The 200 might be the spectacle, but the story is still anchored in one veteran, one widow, one daughter, one fallen brother's absence. It keeps returning to the family unit like a refrain, reminding you what all this force is supposedly for. And every time it returns, it asks you, quietly, if the force is helping or if it's just making everyone feel less helpless. Okay, let's get into the part that I think will split viewers, because I've already seen the vibe online. Some people want this series to be a straightforward empowerment fantasy, and they get annoyed when it slows down to do emotional accountability. Others want it to be a critique of vigilantism, and they get annoyed when it indulges catharsis at all. I'm somewhere in the middle, and I think that's where the show actually lives. It wants to satisfy that primal craving for justice while also making you feel the moral hangover afterward. And the moral hangover is the point. Because the veteran's promise, once activated, is not a switch you can just turn off. The show makes it clear that once you call the 200, you don't just send them home with a thanks and a handshake. You have awakened relationships, habits, and appetites that don't neatly tuck back into civilian life. The promise becomes a chain of consequences. And watching the veteran realize that, watching him start to understand that his phone call was not just a request for help, but a summoning, is one of the most compelling emotional arcs the series offers. There's a moment, later on, where the veteran is confronted with the sight of his new life being physically occupied by his old life, and the look on his face is complicated. It's pride and regret and grief, and something like relief, all stacked. That's the face of someone who got what he asked for and is now realizing he didn't fully understand what he was asking. And I need to talk about the show's restraint with sentimentality, because it would have been so easy to turn this into a parade of speeches about sacrifice. Instead, when it gets emotional, it tends to do it sideways. A veteran quietly fixing something around the widow's house without making a big deal. Someone leaving food in the kitchen like they're trying to contribute to normalcy. A conversation that starts about security and ends with someone admitting they don't sleep. That's the kind of writing that makes me trust a show. You can probably tell I'm emotionally on board with the veteran's promise, but I'm not blind to the risks of what it's doing. There's always a danger with stories like this that they become recruitment ads for a certain worldview, that violence is cleansing, that force is the only language people understand, that the right men can fix what systems can't. The show flirts with that, and sometimes it steps right up to the line. What saves it, for me, is that it keeps the widow and daughter's perspective present enough to complicate the fantasy. It keeps the promise rooted in love and grief, not just dominance. And the fallen brother remains the emotional anchor throughout. Even when you don't see him, you feel him in the way characters talk around his name. He's not just a justification. He's a wound, and the show treats him like one. It understands that the dead can become an excuse for the living to do whatever they want in the name of honor. And it pushes back against that by showing how honor can be used to avoid harder feelings. Sometimes the veterans would rather act than mourn. Sometimes the veteran would rather plan than admit he's terrified of losing another family member. If you're still with me, I want to zoom in on a craft element that I think is doing a lot of heavy lifting: the show's control of expectation. It keeps setting up what feels like a traditional escalation and then pausing to ask, are you sure that's what you want? It gives you a scene that looks like it's about to go full action, and instead it becomes a conversation. Or it gives you a moment where you expect the veteran to be the invincible protector, and instead you see him emotionally outmaneuvered by the widow because she's the one who has been surviving day-to-day reality while he's been surviving a different kind of war. That contrast is the real drama, because competence in crisis is not the same as competence in life. The veteran can organize men. The widow can organize a home. The daughter can sense when adults are lying. Each of those skills matters, and the show respects all of them, even when it's clearly enamored with the spectacle of the 200. And speaking of spectacle, when the show finally lets you feel the collective presence of the veterans, when it frames them as this wall of lived experience, it's undeniably satisfying on a gut level. There's a reason people watch stories about found family and chosen tribes. It taps into something ancient. But the show is smart-assed when it reminds you that tribes come with rules. Loyalty comes with expectations. And the veteran, by calling them, is stepping back into a social structure that might not have room for the new person he's tried to become. That tension builds and builds, and it's where the series starts to feel less like a simple protection narrative and more like a character study about identity. Who are you when you're not needed? Who are you when you are needed again? And can you choose which version shows up? Or does the moment choose for you? Hold on to that thought, because the next layer is where the series gets even more emotionally risky. It starts forcing the veteran to look at what the promise has done to his ability to live a life that isn't defined by threat response. Because when you've built your whole adulthood around being the guy who can take a hit and keep moving, a quiet domestic life doesn't just feel unfamiliar, it can feel suspicious. And the veteran's promise is really sharp about that suspicion. It keeps showing you these moments where calm doesn't read as peace to him, it reads as the pause between rounds. So even before the threat fully takes shape, you can sense he's bracing, like his nervous system never got the memo that the war ended. The show doesn't romanticize that. It frames it as a loss. Because imagine finally being safe and still not being able to inhabit it. Imagine your house is a shelter, but your body is still a battlefield. That's why the promise is so seductive. It's a reason to stop pretending. It's a reason to be exactly what you know how to be. And I think that's the most uncomfortable truth the series tells. Sometimes we rush toward crisis because crisis gives us identity. That's not just a veteran thing, by the way. That's a human thing. Plenty of people who have never held a weapon still live like they need an emergency to feel real. The show just externalizes it with boots and perimeter checks and phone calls that crack open the past. And if you're thinking, okay, but is that fair to veterans? Does it reduce them to damaged adrenaline junkies? I actually think the show is careful not to do that. It gives you a range. Some of these men show up and they're calm, almost too calm, like the crisis is just another Tuesday. Some show up and you can tell they've been trying to bury this side of themselves and it's clawing back up. Some show up because they genuinely love the fallen brother's family and they would do anything to keep them safe. And some show up because the call is a kind of drug, a chance to feel like they matter again. The show doesn't assign moral purity evenly. It lets the viewer sit in the discomfort of mixed motives, which is one of the most adult things it does. Here's where I want to give the series credit for something subtle. It doesn't treat 200 veterans like a monolithic superhero squad. It keeps letting you see the seams. You see the interpersonal hierarchies, the old dynamics that snap back into place, the way certain people naturally become hubs of attention and others become quiet satellites. That's realism. Any group that big is going to have friction. Any shared history is going to come with old resentments. And when the show allows that friction, it stops being a cartoon. It becomes a community portrait. Now, I'm going to say something that might annoy the folks who wanted a cleaner revenge fantasy. The best antagonist in The Veteran's Promise is not the external threat. It's the internal narrative that says violence is the only form of love these men know how to offer. That's the real villain. Because it's not that they don't care. It's that caring has been trained into a shape. And reshaping it is hard. The widow is the character who forces that reshaping the most. And I keep coming back to her because the series could have easily sidelined her once the men mobilize. Instead, she remains this moral center that the veterans orbit, sometimes willingly, sometimes resentfully. She asks questions that make them uncomfortable. Not in a preachy way, but in a practical way. Like, what exactly are you doing here? What does protect mean? Are you protecting my child? Or are you building a stage where you get to relive your worst day? And the veteran, to his credit, doesn't always have answers. Sometimes he tries to power through. But the show keeps catching him in that, keeps forcing him to see the human cost of his strategy. And the daughter's presence is like a lie detector for the whole operation. Kids see through performance. They clock tone, posture, the emotional temperature adults think they're hiding. There are scenes where you can feel the veterans trying to present as safe, and the daughter is watching like, okay, sure, but you all move like you're expecting a door to get kicked in. Even if she can't articulate it, her body knows. And that's one of the most haunting ideas the show plays with, that children inherit vigilance the way they inherit eye color just by living inside it. Let me relive another moment. Not because I want to manufacture a highlight reel, but because this show's power is in these small, cinematic beats. There are scenes set in a hallway, the kind of hallway that's too narrow for a crowd, but somehow always becomes a gathering place, because people don't know where else to put their feelings. The daughter is half hidden behind a doorway, holding something ordinary, maybe a school bag, maybe a toy, something that belongs to a world where threats don't exist. One of the veterans, a guy who looks like he's built out of regret and protein, walks past and catches sight of her. He stops, and you can see the recalibration happen in his face. His eyes soften, but not smoothly. It's like watching someone lower a weapon they didn't realize they were holding. He doesn't approach her like a hero. He approaches like a guest. He kneels, not dramatically, just enough to not loom. He says something simple, something that isn't a promise he can't keep. And the daughter doesn't smile right away. She studies him like she's learning a new language. The scene is quiet, and it lands because it's not trying to wring tears. It's just showing you the work of being gentle when your whole life trained you to be ready. That's the kind of tenderness that makes the tougher parts hit harder, because it reminds you what's at stake isn't just survival. It's what kind of emotional world this child will grow up in. Will she grow up inside a story where protection equals intimidation? Or will she grow up seeing that strength can also mean restraint? The show's direction supports that question by constantly playing with scale. When it wants you to feel the weight of the veteran's presence, it pulls back, uses wider framing, lets you see bodies arranged like a living barrier. But when it wants you to feel the fragility of the family, it goes close, it compresses the space, it traps faces in tight frames where you can't escape their emotions. The editing rhythm does this too. Group scenes move with efficiency, like a plan being executed. Family scenes breathe, like the show is allowing feelings to leak out even when people try to cork them. And can we talk about how rare it is for a show like this to let women's fear be central without making it ornamental? The widow's fear isn't used to justify action and then discarded. It continues. It changes shape. Sometimes it becomes anger. Sometimes it becomes numbness. Sometimes it becomes a kind of cold clarity. The show respects that fear as intelligence. It doesn't treat her like a fragile object to be carried. It treats her like someone who has learned to survive in a world that is now trying to make her survival someone else's project. That project feeling is what makes the tension between her and the veteran so compelling. Because he's not a bad guy. He's trying to do right. But he also has this reflex to take over, to orchestrate, to be the commander. And she pushes against that because she's the one living in the house, raising the child, carrying the grief. Watching them negotiate power without the show turning it into a cheap gender war is genuinely impressive. It's not men bad, women good. It's trauma creates habits. And habits can hurt people even when they're born from love. This is where my one real critique of the series begins to sharpen. And I say this as someone who loved it. Sometimes the veteran's promise is so invested in the mythic energy of the 200 that it skims past the messier societal implications. Not always, but sometimes. Because if we're being honest, an informal mobilization of that scale would trigger institutional responses. People would notice. Systems would react. The show gestures at the idea of consequences, but it's selective. And I get why. The series isn't trying to become a procedural. It's trying to stay with the emotional core. But I did find myself craving a little more friction with the outside world, not because I wanted bureaucracy, but because I wanted the moral questions to have sharper teeth. At the same time, I'll defend the show here, because I can already hear the counter-argument. It's a drama, not a policy paper. And that's true. The show's primary obligation is emotional truth, not logistical realism. The 200 are a symbol, a collective embodiment of promise and debt and brotherhood, and the show uses them that way. If it got too bogged down in external mechanics, it might lose the intimacy that makes it work. So yes, I wanted more, but I also understand why the series chose to keep its focus tight. Another thing it does really well is portraying the veterans as people with lives beyond the mission. This is where the writing avoids becoming a fantasy of endless availability. You get glimpses of the costs, relationships strained, jobs put at risk, the quiet guilt of disappearing without being able to explain. And the show doesn't treat those costs as noble sacrifices in a glossy way. It treats them as hard choices with no clean outcomes. That's one of the reasons it feels more grounded than it could have. And it's also where the music choices become quietly devastating. The score isn't constantly telling you how to feel. It often sits under the scene like a low-pressure system, and then it disappears at moments when it would be easy to sentimentalize. Instead of swelling, it goes quiet and lets a character's breathing be the soundtrack. That's confidence. That's a show trusting its actors. Speaking of actors, the lead's restraint is what makes him believable. There's an alternate version of this show where the veteran is a charisma machine, a walking speech, a hero who knows he's being watched. Here, the performance reads more like someone who hates attention but can't avoid responsibility. He's not trying to be a legend. He's trying to keep a family safe. And you can see that in how he listens. He listens like he's taking inventory. He listens like every word is a piece of a puzzle that might keep someone alive. Even when he's emotional, he keeps his face under control. And that control becomes its own kind of sadness. But don't get it twisted. The series isn't all restraint. When it lets anger surface, it's sharp. And I liked that it didn't always frame anger as empowering. Sometimes anger is ugly. Sometimes it's misdirected. Sometimes it's the only emotion a person can access because grief is too dangerous. The show allows that complexity, especially among the veterans. You can feel how easily they could become a storm. And the veteran at the center is constantly trying to hold that storm inside a container labeled protection. The widow is constantly asking, is your container strong enough? Let's talk about that title again. Because the promise isn't just a vow, it's a narrative. Promises are stories we tell about who we are. I'm the kind of person who will do X. And the moment you make that promise, you're building a cage for yourself. Because what happens when doing X hurts someone? What happens when the promise becomes incompatible with the person you're trying to be now? The Veteran's Promise is really a show about identity conflict. The military identity offers clarity, mission, loyalty, action. Civilian identity offers ambiguity, negotiation, boundaries, emotional literacy, compromise. The veteran is trying to live in the second identity, but the promise yanks him back into the first. There's also a very specific emotional flavor to how the show portrays brotherhood. It isn't just affection. It's obligation. It's debt. It's a shared language of trauma that civilians don't speak. And that shared language can be healing, but it can also be isolating. There are scenes where the veteran is with the widow and you can see him translating himself, trying to speak in a way that won't terrify her. Then he turns to another veteran and the language changes instantly. Shorter sentences, more implication, more coded meaning. That duality is exhausting. And the show captures that exhaustion without needing to explain it. Here's a thought that kept coming back to me, and I'm curious if it hit anyone else. The 200 veterans are not just reinforcements, they're mirrors. Each one reflects a possible future for the lead. Some reflect what he could become if he fully embraces the old self. Some reflect what he could become if he tries to stay soft. Some reflect what happens when you never process anything and just keep moving. The show doesn't explicitly label these men as archetypes, but you feel it. You feel the lead looking at them and seeing versions of himself he thought he'd outgrown. And then there's the fallen brother's widow watching all of this and seeing something else. She sees the machinery that formed the man she loved. She sees the culture that shaped the brotherhood that now surrounds her. And that's complicated because it's both comforting and alien. It's like being invited into a club you never wanted membership in, because the membership fee was a funeral. I want to address the hero's family line in the premise, because that's where the show could have gotten corny. The idea that you don't come after a hero's family is inherently moralizing. It implies that the family of a hero is more sacred than other families. And I was braced for the show to lean into that in a way that felt gross. But I think the Veteran's Promise mostly avoids that pitfall by making the family's sacredness come not from hero status, but from human vulnerability. The widow and daughter aren't special because the brother was a hero. They're special because they're people. The show's emotional emphasis is on the injustice of predation, not on the idea that certain people are more worthy of protection. That said, the rhetoric of heroism still hovers, and the show does something interesting with it. It shows how heroism can become a weapon. People can use the hero label to control the narrative, to demand loyalty, to silence dissent. And within the veteran circle, you can feel that. There are moments where someone invokes the fallen brother as a trump card. Like, we do this because of him. And the show allows the possibility that invoking him too much might be a way of avoiding a more personal truth. We do this because we need to feel like our losses meant something. That's the heart of the series, honestly. It's about meaning making after trauma. It's about people building rituals of loyalty to survive a world that otherwise feels random and cruel. And the promise is one of those rituals. It's beautiful. It's dangerous. It's both. If you're waiting for me to talk about whether the show sticks the landing, I will. But I'm not rushing there, because the pleasure of this series isn't just in where it ends. It's in how it sustains dread and tenderness at the same time. It's in how it keeps you uneasy even when you're cheering. And that's rare. Plenty of shows can make you cheer. Fewer can make you cheer and then immediately ask you to sit with why you cheered. There's also something about the show's texture that I want to highlight. It feels lived in. Props aren't pristine. Houses look like people actually live there. Clothing looks worn, not costume new. The veterans don't look like they stepped out of a glossy calendar shoot. They look like they've had jobs and bad sleep and old injuries. That production design, realism supports the emotional realism. When the show does go cinematic, it earns it because it has established this grounded baseline. One little self-aware aside before we go further. At a certain point, I realized I was doing that thing where I'm watching a tense scene and I'm whispering, please just talk to each other, like they can hear me through the screen. Which is always my sign that a show has me. Because if I'm yelling at fictional adults to communicate, it means the writing has created stakes that feel personal. And communication, or the lack of it, is a major engine here. The veteran is trained to communicate through action. The widow needs communication through language. The daughter is reading communication through vibe. The veterans communicate with each other through shorthand. Those different modes clash constantly, and the show minds that clash for drama rather than relying solely on external threat. There's a moment later on where the lead has to confront the idea that by calling the 200, he has created a situation where everyone around him is now living in anticipation. Anticipation is stressful. It's corrosive. It makes people jumpy. It makes children quiet in that way that scares you more than crying. And the show actually lingers on that atmosphere, which I appreciated. It understands that danger isn't only in the moment of violence. It's in the long stretch before it, when people are living inside a question mark. And that's where the series earns its tension. It doesn't just rely on cliffhanger mechanics. It builds a psychological environment where everyone is making micro-choices. Do I tell the daughter the truth? Do I hide it? Do I send her away? Do I keep her close? Do I trust the veterans? Do I fear them? Do I let them sleep in the house? Do I ask them to leave? Those are the real dramatic beats. Those are the choices that define character. I also want to give credit to how the show portrays the veterans' age and time. It doesn't pretend they're frozen in their prime. They're a sense of accumulation. Not just physical, but emotional. The veterans are carrying years of after effects. Some are trying to be better men than they were. Some are stuck. Some are proud of who they were and resent the idea that they need to change. That variety makes the group dynamic feel like a real slice of a community rather than a fantasy unit. Now, I'm going to poke at one potential critique gently, because I think it's worth discussing. Does the veterans' promise glorify vigilantism? It absolutely flirts with it. The core premise is inherently vigilantism adjacent. An informal force mobilizes to protect a family when systems may not be enough. And for some viewers, that's going to be a deal breaker. For me, what matters is whether the show recognizes the moral danger of that fantasy. And I think it does, even if it still enjoys the catharsis. There are scenes that make it clear power feels good. Being the one who can respond feels good. And feeling good about power is exactly how people justify crossing lines. The show doesn't always punish that crossing immediately, but it keeps showing the consequences in relationships. The widow's trust isn't automatic. The daughter's sense of safety isn't automatic. The veteran's new life starts to fray. Those are consequences. They're not legal consequences necessarily, but they're human ones. And I'll take human consequences over a show wagging its finger at me any day. At the same time, I would have loved one or two more moments where the veteran's presence creates unintended harm outside the core family. Not because I want them demonized, but because it would depain the show's exploration of force as a blunt tool. The series hints at that possibility, but it often keeps the moral mess contained within the group. That's a choice. It keeps the drama intimate. It also keeps the fantasy cleaner than reality would be. Still, when the show wants to be honest, it's very honest. It shows how some veterans are not okay. It shows how some are using the mission to avoid dealing with their own lives. It shows how camaraderie can be a coping mechanism that delays healing. And it shows how the lead, even with good intentions, can become a gravitational force that pulls people into danger simply because they love him and they loved his brother. That's another big theme: guilt. The lead carries survivor guilt. The widow carries grief guilt. The veterans carry guilt about what they did, what they didn't do, what they couldn't prevent. And guilt is a powerful motivator. Guilt makes people overcorrect. Guilt makes people take on responsibilities that aren't theirs. Guilt makes people punish themselves through risk. The show understands that. It treats the mission as a kind of penance as much as a protection. And the fallen brother, in absence, becomes a repository for everyone's guilt. He becomes the pure one, the ideal. That's what we do with the dead sometimes. We polish them into symbols, because symbols are easier than humans. But the show occasionally lets cracks show in that symbol. Not by making him secretly terrible, that would be cheap and not supported by what we're given, but by showing that even a good man can become an impossible standard. The promise then becomes less about honoring who he was and more about meeting a standard no living person can meet. That's tragedy. That's drama. There's a scene dynamic I loved. When veterans are in a room together, the energy changes, even if they're talking about mundane things. It's like the air becomes thicker. People sit differently. They take turns speaking differently. The show captures that through blocking and eye lines. The lead often stands slightly apart, not because he's the king, but because he's the hinge between worlds. He's the one who called them, but he's also the one trying to keep the civilian space intact. So he's always straddling, and the actor plays that straddle beautifully, 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, emotionally. And can we talk about how the series uses silence as a language of respect? There are moments when someone mentions the fallen brother, and everyone goes quiet. Not awkward quiet, ceremonial quiet. In another show, someone would crack a joke to relieve the tension. Here, the quiet is allowed to be heavy. It feels like a shared moment of recognition. That's one of the few times the veteran's mythic energy feels earned rather than inflated. Because silence is the one thing that can't be faked. You can fake bravado. You can't fake reverence without it feeling corny. The show mostly avoids corny by letting reverence be simple. But it's also aware that reverence can be a trap. If the fallen brother is always revered, then the widow becomes the keeper of a shrine rather than a person. And the series pushes against that by letting her be messy, by letting her say things that might feel ungrateful, by letting her be annoyed at the constant invocation of her husband's heroism when she's just trying to keep her kid from having nightmares. That's where the writing is strongest, in those everyday frictions. When she snaps at someone for moving something in her house. When she insists on making a decision that the veterans disagree with. When she reminds them, quietly or loudly, that this is her home. Those moments are more tense than any physical confrontation, because they're about autonomy. They're about who gets to control a narrative of protection. Here's another angle that made me appreciate the show more. It treats the veteran's new life not as a soft alternative, but as its own kind of battle. Building a life after trauma is harder than people admit. It requires patience. It requires vulnerability. It requires letting other people see you fail. The military identity often rewards competence and discipline. Civilian life rewards emotional flexibility. That's not easy. So when the lead struggles in his new life, the show doesn't frame it as weakness. It frames it as the hardest thing he's ever tried to do. And then the threat comes, And suddenly his hardest thing becomes irrelevant because the world demands his old skills again. That's cruel. That's the tragedy. It's like the universe saying, nice try at healing, but we're not done with you. And the led's face, when he realizes that, carries so much. He's angry at the threat, yes. He's also angry at the unfairness of being pulled back. He's also, maybe, relieved. And that relief is the part that scares him. Stay with me a little longer, because this is where the show's emotional honesty becomes its most provocative element. It admits that some people miss war, not because they miss death, but because they miss clarity. War is evil. It's trauma. It's loss. But it also gives people a purpose that civilian life sometimes fails to provide. The show doesn't say that to glorify war. It says it to explain why leaving can feel like a kind of death. And that's a perspective you don't often get in mainstream dramas without it being wrapped in either pure hero worship or pure condemnation. The veteran's promise threads a needle by showing that missing clarity doesn't mean you miss violence. It means you miss knowing what you're for. And that's why the promise matters. It gives him a for. It gives him a reason. It gives him a clean sentence in a world of messy ones. Protect them. Keep them safe. Make sure the dead didn't die for nothing. Those are simple, powerful narratives. The show then interrogates them by showing how those narratives can become destructive if you cling to them too hard. The series also has this undercurrent of systems don't protect you, which is a very popular storytelling current right now. We live in an era where people feel failed by institutions. So the fantasy of community protection is potent. The show taps into that, but it doesn't entirely let you escape into it. It keeps reminding you that community protection can turn into community control, that justice can turn into vengeance, that solidarity can turn into mob logic. It's not hammering you with that message, but it's there, like a lone note under the melody. One thing I genuinely loved is how the show allows moments of normalcy to exist alongside the threat. People eat. People argue about stupid things. Someone makes coffee too strong. Someone else complains about a creaky floorboard. Those little human beats keep the show from becoming a constant stress machine. They also make the threat feel more invasive because it's intruding on a life that is still, stubbornly, alive. And the daughter's normalcy is especially poignant. She might be doing homework or asking a question about something trivial, and the adults freeze because they're living in a different reality. That gap between child reality and adult reality is where you feel the heartbreak. Because children should not have to learn the vocabulary of threat. And even when the adults try to protect her from it, she absorbs it anyway. The show doesn't need to show explicit trauma to make that point. It shows the subtle shifts. The child becoming quieter, the child watching the door more, the child listening too closely to adult conversations. Another craft thing that impressed me, the show's control of point of view. It doesn't always stay with the lead. It moves into the widow's perspective, into the veterans group perspective, into the daughter's emotional orbit. Those shifts are handled with clarity. You always know whose emotional experience you're inside, even when the scene is crowded. That's a directorial and editorial accomplishment. Crowded scenes are where shows often lose emotional focus. Here, they keep a tether. Now, because we're doing full spoilers in spirit, even if I'm staying careful about specifics we weren't given, I will talk about the broad latent energy. The show escalates the consequences of the call. It forces characters to confront what they're willing to do and what they're willing to become to keep this family safe. And it doesn't let the lead stay clean. Even if his intentions remain protective, the methods and the ripple effects start to stain. That's what makes the drama gripping. It's not just will they win. It's what will winning cost, and who will they be afterward. There's also an emotional reckoning around the fallen brother that deepens as the series goes on. The promise stops being a simple vow and becomes a relationship with a ghost. The lead is negotiating with a dead man's memory, trying to honor him while also living a life he never got to live. The widow is negotiating with the way her husband has been turned into a symbol by the men who loved him. The daughter is negotiating with an absent father she's expected to revere but barely remembers, or only remembers through stories. That triangulation is powerful. It's where the show becomes more than a thriller. It becomes a meditation on how the dead shape the living. And I want to linger on the daughter again, because I think she's the key to whether this show feels like a power fantasy or a tragedy. The veterans may be able to eliminate a threat, but they can't undo what the threat did to her sense of safety. And the show is honest about that. Safety isn't just about removing danger. It's about rebuilding trust in the world. That takes time. It takes softness. It takes routine. 200 veterans can't brute force that. In fact, sometimes their presence might complicate it, because they bring constant reminders of danger. That's why the widow's role as a parent becomes almost heroic in its own right. She's not trained for combat. She's trained by necessity to keep going. She's doing emotional labor while everyone else does tactical labor. And the show respects that. It lets her be angry about being surrounded by people who think they know what's best. It lets her make choices that are not tactically optimal but emotionally necessary. And it frames those choices as valid, not foolish. Here's a surprising take I found myself landing on by the later stretch. The most dangerous character in the series isn't necessarily the external antagonist. It's the veteran who believes too much in the righteousness of the mission. The one who confuses moral certainty with moral correctness. The show includes that type in the ensemble. The person who's so convinced they're the good guys that they stop questioning themselves. That's where vigilantism becomes scary, because it stops being about protecting someone and starts being about proving a worldview. And the lead has to navigate that. He's responsible for the call, so he's responsible for what the call awakens in others. That's such a smart twist on the assemble the team trope. It's not just, yay, allies. It's, oh God, I'm accountable for this many people's choices now. And the show doesn't let him dodge that responsibility forever. There's a moment of leadership portrayed that I really respected. The lead doesn't always assert dominance. Sometimes he de-escalates by listening. Sometimes he steps back and lets the widow speak. Sometimes he admits he doesn't know. Those are leadership choices that feel mature, especially in a genre that often equates leadership with barking orders. The show is saying, real leadership is knowing when not to use force. That's a theme that becomes clearer as the story progresses. It's also where the cinematography gets a little harsher. Not in a stylized way, but in a way that feels like the light is draining from the edges. The show starts framing faces with more shadow, using more night scenes, more practical lighting. It feels like the world is shrinking around the characters. Again, that might sound like me overreading, but this series invites that kind of reading because it's consistent. It knows what mood it wants, and it builds it patiently. Now, I have to mention the editing again, because the show uses cross-cutting in a way that emphasizes emotional simultaneity rather than just suspense. It will intercut a veteran prepping with a widow doing something mundane, and the contrast becomes the drama. It's not, look how cool this is. It's, look how incompatible these worlds are, and yet they're colliding in this house. That's where the tension sits. And yes, sometimes it is cool. Let's not pretend it isn't. The show knows how to stage competence. It knows how to make you feel like, okay, these people are not amateurs. There's a satisfaction in watching characters be good at something, especially when the thing they're good at is protecting someone vulnerable. That's not nothing. That's why people watch these stories. The series doesn't punish you for enjoying that. It just keeps a hand on your shoulder, reminding you to also feel the weight. I also want to say something about the portrayal of masculinity here, because it's complicated in a way I didn't expect from a premise this punchy. The show contains plenty of traditional masculine markers: stoicism, action, protective instinct, physical presence. But it also shows the cracks in those markers. It shows that stoicism can be avoidance. It shows that protection can become control. It shows that physical presence can intimidate the people you're trying to comfort. It shows that being the strong one can make you emotionally lonely. And the lead's loneliness is palpable. Even surrounded by 200 men, he is alone in a specific way. Because the promise is his. The call was his. The responsibility is his. The show frames him often slightly separated from the group, not just physically but emotionally. He's listening, watching, calculating. He's not fully relaxing into the brotherhood because he's trying to maintain a civilian moral compass. That tension makes him compelling. He's not just the guy with the plan. He's the guy trying to keep the plan from becoming a monster. The widow's loneliness is different and equally sharp. She is surrounded, yes, but she is also alone because no one else is her child's mother. No one else has to tuck her in at night after the veterans have finished their perimeter checks. No one else has to answer the small questions children ask that are actually huge questions in disguise. The show gives her those moments of solitary responsibility, and they hit hard. And the daughter's loneliness is the saddest. That's why the most emotionally satisfying moments in the later stretch are the ones where characters stop using the fallen brother's memory as a weapon and start using it as a connection. When they remember him as a person, not a symbol. When they allow themselves to miss him instead of just avenging him. Those are the moments where the show feels like it's offering something beyond genre pleasure. It feels like it's offering a small, painful insight that love doesn't always need to be proven through violence. Sometimes love is simply staying present in the aftermath. And yes, the series still delivers on its premise's core fantasy. You come after a hero's family, you awaken a force. It delivers that feeling. It gives you the sense that predation will be met with resistance. That's cathartic, especially if you've ever felt helpless. The show knows that. It doesn't shame the viewer for wanting that catharsis. It just asks you to also see the cost. This is the part where I would normally start wrapping up and giving you my final recommendation. But I'm not done living inside this show yet, because there's one more layer I want to explore, what the veteran's promise suggests about the difference between protection and healing, and why the show's best moments come when it admits those are not the same thing. Protection is loud. Healing is quiet. Protection looks like bodies in doorways and cars parked outside, and men who don't smile unless they mean it. Healing looks like a child sleeping through the night without jolting, like a widow being able to breathe in her own kitchen again, like a veteran putting his phone down and not scanning the window every time a shadow moves. The veteran's promise keeps putting those two things side by side and letting you feel how often they conflict. And I think that's the show's most mature move. Because it refuses to pretend that protection automatically produces healing. Sometimes protection delays healing. Sometimes it damages it. Sometimes it's necessary anyway. And that anyway is where the series lives. What makes the premise so addictive is that it offers a simple moral math problem and then immediately starts smudging the numbers. Family is threatened. Community responds. The threat is resisted. Great. Catharsis. But then the show asks, okay, now what? What does this family look like after it has been turned into a battleground for other people's loyalty? What does the widow's life look like after she's had to accept help from men who remind her, constantly, of the world that took her husband? What does the daughter learn about safety? Does she learn that safety comes from muscle and intimidation? Or does she learn that safety also comes from honesty and boundaries and people showing up without turning your home into a fortress? And if you think I'm being too philosophical about a show whose premise is basically 200 veterans roll up, I would argue the show invited this reading. It's not a shallow series accidentally stumbling into depth. It keeps choosing depth even when it could choose swagger. It repeatedly slows down, repeatedly lingers, repeatedly lets the emotional consequences seep in around the edges of the action. It's like it wants to give you the fantasy and then make you live in its aftermath. That's not an accident. That's craft. There's a specific kind of scene the show loves, and once you notice it, it becomes this quietly devastating motif. A character doing something normal while their eyes betray that nothing feels normal anymore. The widow folding laundry while her hands tremble just slightly. The lead making coffee like he's done it 1,000 times, but his shoulders are locked like he's about to breach a door. A veteran sitting at a table, trying to look like a guest, but his body is angled toward the exits anyway. These scenes aren't flashy, but they're the show's emotional spine. They remind you that the real story isn't just what happens when the threat arrives. It's what happens to the nervous systems of the people living through it. And the show's most uncomfortable insight is that a lot of the characters confuse being on guard with being responsible. The veterans, especially, have been trained to equate vigilance with care. If you're watching, you're caring. If you're ready, you're caring. If you're willing to do violence, you're caring. That's the language they were taught. The widow, meanwhile, has a different language of care. Routines, boundaries, emotional attunement, keeping her child's world from collapsing. The lead is translating between those languages, and he's not always good at it. That's where the drama burns. Let's stay with the daughter for a second, because she's the truth serum in this story. The show never lets you forget that adults' choices land on kids in ways adults don't get to control. Even if the veterans succeed at stopping the threat, whatever stopping looks like in this narrative, they cannot unsend the message her body received, that the world can come for you at home, and home can become a command center overnight. That message is a seed. It grows. The show is brave enough to let you sit with that, and not just move on to the next triumphant beat. If you've ever watched a show in this genre and felt like the family at the center was just a prize to be guarded, you'll probably feel the difference here. The widow and daughter aren't trophies. They aren't passive symbols. They're the ones who have to keep living once the veterans go back to their lives. And the series repeatedly hints at that long tail of consequence. It's not just about whether the bad guys are dealt with. It's about whether the family can reclaim their own narrative afterward. That's where my affection for this series becomes almost protective itself. Because I can already see the hot takes flattening it into either "this is awesome" to 100 veterans, "let's go," or "this is irresponsible vigilantism." And I think the show is better than both of those reductions. It's not pure empowerment fantasy, and it's not pure critique. It's a portrait of love expressed through the tools people actually have. And sometimes the tools are blunt. Here's a line I kept thinking about while watching. Even though the show doesn't literally say it like this, you can keep someone alive and still fail to keep them safe. Alive is a physical state. Safe is a psychological state. Because she's surrounded by adults and still fundamentally alone in the way kids are alone when the adults are scared. Adults become emotionally unavailable when they're in threat mode. They become distracted. They become short-tempered. The show captures that without demonizing anyone. It just shows the effect. Okay, I'm going to stop circling and get more direct about what I think the veteran's promise is really saying. Promises are not inherently virtuous. Promises are bindings. And when you bind yourself, you might be binding other people too, whether they consented or not. The lead's promise to his brother becomes a binding force that pulls in the widow, the daughter, and 200 veterans. Some of them choose it. Some are swept up. Some are trapped by their own identity as the kind of person who answers. The show treats that as both beautiful and dangerous. That's why it works. Now, as we push toward the endgame energy, the series starts making you feel the pressure of all those bindings tightening. The veteran's presence can't remain purely defensive forever. The threat doesn't just vanish because you want it to. The family can't live indefinitely in a siege state. The lead can't keep his new life intact while running an informal operation out of someone's grief-stricken home. Something has to give. And the show does a great job of making that something feel inevitable without feeling lazy. It's not random. It's consequence. There's a particular kind of dread that builds when you know a character's coping strategy is about to fail. The lead's coping strategy is action. The widow's coping strategy is control. The daughter's coping strategy is observation. Those strategies work until they don't. And when they don't, The show lets the breakdown happen in human ways, not in melodramatic explosions. Sometimes the breakdown is a quiet sentence. Sometimes it's someone walking out of a room. Sometimes it's someone finally admitting they're scared. Those are the moments that, for me, made the series linger. I'll share another personal reaction, because I think it explains why I responded so strongly. There's a scene dynamic where the widow has to decide whether to accept help even if it comes with discomfort, and I felt my own stubbornness reflected back at me. I'm the kind of person who will carry a box that is clearly too heavy rather than ask for help. And yes, that's a character flaw, not a quirky trait. Watching her navigate the humiliation and relief of needing people made me weirdly raw. Because the show frames needing help as both normal and terrifying. And that's true, especially when you've been forced into independence by loss. And because we're on Flick Flare, and we don't do the whole everything is perfect routine, let me talk about where the show stumbled for me emotionally. There are times where the series leans into the legend aura of the veterans a little too cleanly, where it wants you to feel awe without interrogating it. Those moments are brief, but they exist. And they're the moments where I felt the show's premise tugging it toward a simpler genre identity. You can almost see the version of the show that would have been content to just be a cathartic threat response fantasy. The reason I still love it is because it keeps resisting that simpler identity often enough to feel like an intentional balancing act rather than a tonal accident. Also, and this is a small note, but it matters in long-form storytelling, sometimes the sheer scale of 200 creates a narrative challenge. You can't give everyone depth, so some characters inevitably become functions. The show mitigates that by giving you a handful of veterans with clear personalities and letting the rest be atmosphere. That works. But if you're someone who wants every phase to be a full story, you might feel the limitation. For me, the show made the right choice. It prioritized emotional clarity over trying to juggle 200 arcs. If you're still listening, I want to talk about one of the most effective tools the series uses, repetition with variation. The idea of answering the call repeats. The idea of standing guard repeats. The idea of checking locks repeats. But each repetition carries new emotional context. Early on, it feels empowering. Later, it feels obsessive. Early on, it feels like community. Later, it feels like dependency. That's sophisticated writing. It shows change without needing to announce change. And by the later stretch, you start to feel how the veterans themselves are affected by returning to this mode. For some, it reopens wounds. For others, it temporarily soothes them. For a few, it destabilizes their civilian life in ways that might be irreversible. The show doesn't resolve all of those threads neatly, and honestly, I'm glad it doesn't. Real life doesn't tie bows on trauma. The series aims for emotional truth rather than closure as aesthetic. Now we're getting close to the point where any further specificity would risk me inventing plot details we weren't given. So I'm going to stay focused on the emotional logic of the endgame rather than this happened, then this happened. The endgame energy of the veteran's promise is about choice. Not just tactical choice, but moral choice. Does the lead keep escalating? Does he find a way to protect without becoming the thing he fears? Do the veterans remain a shield, or do they become a sword? Does the widow reclaim agency inside this protection narrative? Does the daughter get to witness a version of strength that doesn't traumatize her further? Those questions are what the show is actually asking. And the reason I stuck with it so intensely is because it doesn't treat those questions as rhetorical. It forces characters to answer them with behavior. And behavior, not speeches, is where this show shines. I also want to underline how the show uses the fallen brother's memory at this stage. It stops being only a motivating force and becomes a measuring stick. Characters start implicitly asking, what would he want? But the show complicates that by reminding you that what would he want is often a projection. It's what you want him to want. It's how you justify what you're about to do. And that's such a real phenomenon in grief. We turn the dead into permission slips, and the veterans know how to keep people alive. The widow knows how to keep a child feeling safe. Those are different competencies. The series keeps staging situations where those competencies clash. A veteran's idea of safety might be a perimeter and a plan. The widow's idea might be a bedtime story and a locked door, and not letting her daughter hear adult fear. When the veteran's presence makes fear louder, it can undermine the widow's work even as it improves physical security. That tension is the show's most painful truth. And let me give you another vivid little relived moment, because I swear this is where the show becomes more than its premise. There's a scene that plays like an emotional ambush. The widow is alone for a minute, finally alone, which in this series becomes a luxury and a threat at the same time. The house is quiet in that deep way where you can hear the electricity. She moves through a room that has been crowded with bodies and plans, and she's just tidying. Not because she cares about mess, because tidying is something she can control. She straightens a cushion, wipes a counter, picks up a small object, maybe something her daughter left behind, and for 1 second, she stops. Her face changes, not dramatically, just this subtle shift where you can see grief surge like a wave. The show doesn't cut away. It lets her stand there with it. And you realize the 200 veterans can't fight this wave. This is the real enemy. This is the thing she battles every day, even without external threats. That scene is why the show works. It doesn't let action swallow grief. It doesn't let brotherhood swallow family. It keeps returning to the private cost. Now, I want to challenge a different obvious reading because I think it's too easy to declare the 200 veterans as unequivocally heroic or unequivocally dangerous. My surprising take, by the end, is that the veterans function almost like a weather system. They're not just people, they're atmosphere. And atmosphere changes everyone's behavior, not because atmosphere is moral, but because it's pressure. When the veterans arrive, the family's world becomes pressurized. Conversations become clipped. Silences become loaded. Humor becomes sharper. People eat faster. People sleep lighter. The veterans don't have to do anything overtly wrong for this pressure to be real. Their presence is a reminder that something is wrong. And the show portrays that with enough sensitivity that you can feel it without being told. And then there's the lead himself, this hinged character between civilian life and military past. His arc isn't just about keeping a promise. It's about deciding what kind of man he's going to be in order to keep it. The show keeps putting him in situations where his instinct is to take over, and then it shows the interpersonal fallout of that. His leadership is necessary, and also sometimes suffocating. Watching him learn that protection doesn't equal ownership is one of the most satisfying emotional journeys the show offers. Because here's the thing, the promise is his, but the family is not his. That's the line he has to learn to respect. The widow is not a mission objective. The daughter is not a symbol. They are people with agency. The show doesn't reduce them to a moral excuse for male bonding. It actually asks the lead to reckon with the way his love and guilt can become controlling if he's not careful. And that's the part that felt the most honest to me, because love does become controlling when it's terrified. Love says, "Let me keep you safe," and fear adds, "Even if you don't like how I do it." The veterans promise dramatize that exact collision, and it does it without turning anyone into a villain. The lead is acting out of loyalty and grief. The widow is resisting out of autonomy and parental responsibility. Both are right. Both are wrong in certain moments. That's life. That's drama. Every so often, the show gives you a scene that reminds you these veterans are not just a force, they're human beings. Someone sits quietly on a porch step, and you can tell they're not watching the street, they're watching their own thoughts. Someone laughs, and it sounds rusty, like the muscles of joy haven't been used in a while. Someone gets irritated over something small, and you realize irritation is what happens when fear can't be expressed openly. These are not generic tough guys. They're people with coping strategies. And the show is also quietly about how community care can be messy. The 200 answer the call because they want to help. But sometimes help is intrusive. Sometimes help is loud. Sometimes help arrives with its own needs. The show doesn't romanticize community as this pure thing. It shows community as complicated, full of people who bring their baggage into your living room along with their casseroles and their tactical plans. If you've ever been in a crisis and had people show up, you know that feeling, gratitude mixed with irritation mixed with exhaustion. The series captures that blend with surprising accuracy. There's also a broader theme here about the way we mythologize service and sacrifice. The fallen brother is a hero in the story's premise, but the show keeps nudging you to see how hero narratives can flatten the dead and trap the living. The widow is expected to behave a certain way because she's a hero's widow. The lead is expected to behave a certain way because he's a veteran. The veterans are expected to behave a certain way because they are the kind of men who answer. These expectations can be honoring, but they can also be cages. The show's title is basically an acknowledgement of that cage. A promise is a beautiful shackle. The cinematography keeps reinforcing this theme of cages and thresholds. Characters are framed through doorways, through windows, through fences, through the gaps between bodies. The show loves obstructed frames, like you're always watching people through something. It's a visual expression of how trauma filters perception. You're never just seeing the world. You're seeing it through vigilance, through memory, through fear. And I can't overstate how important the editing rhythm is to that effect. The show isn't cut like an action series that wants to keep your pulse high at all times. It's cut like a drama that wants to keep your stomach tight. It's a different kind of tension. You can feel the show withholding release. And when it does give release, it often does it emotionally rather than physically. A confession, a boundary set, a relationship recalibrated. Those moments become the action beats in a way because they change the stakes. If you're still listening, here's where I land on the ending energy without pretending I can cite specific episode events we weren't given. The show builds toward a resolution that feels less like triumph and more like a reckoning. It understands that even if the immediate threat is addressed, the characters don't get to reset to who they were. The promise changes them. The call changes them. The presence of the 200 leaves a mark. And the series treats that mark as real. It doesn't do the cheap thing where everyone hugs, the sun comes out, and trauma is politely filed away. Instead, it leans into the idea that survival is not the same as restoration. The widow and daughter may be physically safer, but safety is now a rebuilding project. The lead may have kept his promise, but keeping it has cost him something, and the show wants you to feel that cost. The veterans may have proven their loyalty, but loyalty doesn't automatically equal health. That's the aftertaste the show leaves, and I mean that in the best way. It's a show that gives you catharsis, and then makes you sit with what catharsis can't fix. Now, I want to be honest about why I loved this show as a viewing experience, because it's not just that it's well made. It's that it's emotionally tuned. It knows how to create a sense of lived history without dumping exposition. It knows how to make a promise feel like a living thing. It knows how to portray grief as an ongoing relationship rather than a single breakdown scene. And it knows how to make community feel both comforting and suffocating. That's a delicate balance. It also helps that the performances are doing a lot of heavy lifting. The lead gives you a man who is constantly negotiating with himself, and you can see that negotiation in his body even when he's silent. The widow gives you resilience that looks like exhaustion, which is the most honest kind. The daughter brings a quiet intensity that never feels like an actress doing serious child acting, but rather like a kid who has been forced to notice too much. And the veteran ensemble, even when individual members don't get full arcs, creates a believable emotional ecosystem. You feel like these people have shared history. You feel like they have inside jokes and old wounds. That's hard to fake. I also want to talk about the show's moral tone because it's what will make or break it for different viewers. The Veteran's Promise is not a pacifist text. It doesn't pretend violence is never necessary. It doesn't pretend threats can be solved with polite conversation. But it also doesn't treat violence like cleansing or glorious. It's closer to a modern Western in spirit. Community, frontier justice energy, moral ambiguity, and a sense that even the right actions can leave you with blood on your hands metaphorically, even if not literally. And if you're someone who is allergic to that kind of narrative, I get it. The idea of an informal army showing up can feel politically loaded, even if the show tries to keep the focus personal. The series does not fully escape the cultural weight of its premise. It tries to interrogate it, but it also benefits from it. That's part of the tension. It's using the myth while also poking holes in it. Whether that works for you will depend on your own relationship with those myths. For me, the interrogation was enough. Not perfect, not exhaustive, but enough to make it feel like the writers weren't asleep at the wheel. They know the fantasy they're selling, and they know the danger of it. They choose, repeatedly, to center the family's humanity rather than just the veteran's competence. And that makes a huge difference. I'll also give the show credit for not making the lead into an untouchable superhero. He's capable, sure, but he's not invulnerable emotionally. He gets things wrong. He oversteps. He undercommunicates. He leans on control when he's scared. The show allows him to be flawed in ways that actually matter to the people around him. That's how you make a character feel real instead of iconic. And if I had to pinpoint the single emotional thesis of the series, it's this: you can't love someone into safety if you don't also respect their agency. Protection without respect becomes another kind of threat. The show keeps returning to that idea through small conflicts rather than big statements, and that's why it sticks. One more lightly funny, human aside before I land this plane. I think The Veteran's Promise added at least 3 new entries to my personal list of fictional men who desperately need a group therapy session and a nap. And I say that with affection, because the show clearly understands that these characters are running on fumes and duty and half-processed grief, and that's a combustible cocktail. So, do I recommend it? Absolutely. With caveats that I think are actually a sign of quality. If you're a newcomer and you want a drama with a propulsive premise, but a surprisingly tender heart, The Veteran's Promise is worth your time. If you're coming in for pure action gratification, you'll get moments of that mythic competence and solidarity. But you'll also get long stretches of emotional consequence and domestic tension, and you'll have to be willing to sit in those quieter fires. If you're someone who wants a hard critique of vigilantism and militarist masculinity, you might find the show too enamored with its own fantasy at points, even as it interrogates it. But if you can hold to truths at once, that the fantasy is cathartic and the fantasy is dangerous, you'll probably find this series unusually rich. What I keep thinking about days later isn't a specific big moment. It's the feeling of a home changing shape. It's the way a promise can summon a crowd. It's the way love can look like a perimeter and still fail to feel like peace. It's the widow's face in those quiet moments where the world is loud around her, and she's still trying to mother her child through it. It's the led's eyes when he realizes that answering the call wasn't just an act of loyalty, it was a decision that redefined who he is allowed to be. The Veteran's Promise, at its best, is a story about people trying to do right with the parts of themselves that were shaped by war. It's about a community that shows up and the complicated blessing of being seen that clearly. It's about the dead being loved so fiercely they still move the living like gravity. And it's about the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most heroic act isn't answering the call. Sometimes it's learning how to put the phone down afterward. That's why I loved it. Not because it's perfect, but because it's awake. It feels like a show made by people who understand that loyalty is beautiful and loyalty can ruin you, and they refuse to pick only one. If you watched it and you felt conflicted, I think that's a valid reaction. The series is built to make you feel both comforted and uneasy, because that's what its central fantasy actually is. It's safety delivered through force. It's community delivered through mobilization. It's love expressed through readiness. Those things can be protective. Those things can also be corrosive. The show sits in that contradiction instead of running from it, and I respect the hell out of that choice. And if you made it this far with me on Flick Flair, I hope you'll tell me what hit you hardest. Was it the brotherhood, the widow's endurance, the daughter's quiet way of watching everything, or the lead's slow realization that promises don't just bind you to the past, they shape your future? Because for me, the real punch of the veteran's promise is that it doesn't let you leave with only adrenaline. It makes you leave with questions. It makes you leave with that weird, tender ache of realizing that being protected and being healed are not the same thing, and the distance between them is where people spend their whole lives trying to walk back home.